Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Highly Controversial. This is going to be Revelations Part 2. I'm going to do my very best to cover the material from chapter 10 to 13, given that I have enough time. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and recap from a previous video from Revelations Part 1. So the recap would be that Alexander the Great, he conquers the world, also known as Asia, right about at that time period. He steals the birthright of Pharaoh and is given the title of Son of God, as prophesied by the prophet Daniel in chapter 8, the goat and the ram, with Christ actually being the Son of God. This is also why Christ says that when he comes, he will be separating the lambs from the goats. Christ is crucified, he's raised to life, and he tells John, the author of Revelations, a length of prophecies as long as about 10,000 years. And so John sends these 7 letters to the 7 churches or people in Asia, which we know is the 7 continents on the earth. And we get to witness the 7 seals, which is roughly about the first 1,000 years, give or take, of European colonization on every single continent, as prophesied as the terrible day of the Lord by many of the Old Testament prophets, because we know a day to the Lord is 1,000 years. And so if you go back into the Old Testament and read what prophets like Joel and Amos and all the rest of them prophesied, this is the great day of the Lord and the terrible things that happen. All those scary prophecies are about European colonization, everything that came with that. And so that's the first 1,000 years, give or take. That's going to be, that is going to be Revelations 1 all the way up to 8 is about the first 1,000. Is it that? Yeah, about the first 1,000 years or so. So you get the 7 seals. Christ orchestrates that. Then you see him seal the 144 children of Israel. And the colonization that happens on every single continent as a result of the 7 seals would be equal to a great tribulation. And so you see all the souls that came out of the great tribulation that didn't compromise, they are being celebrated in heaven. And then you have chapter 8 through 12, which is the next 1,000 years, give or take. And you see with the 7 trumpets and the different prophecies that hit on the different continents, you see God's people kind of stirring, becoming awake, becoming more self-aware. And you see things like them going up to north for their freedom, and slavery is abolished, and all these different things. And so I think in the last video, I think I stopped right at the 6th trumpet. And so that's where I left off. We're going to go ahead and jump right into chapter 10. We're going to take our time. I'm going to do the best I can to explain. So here we go. And chapter 10 says, I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. And a rainbow was on his head, and his face was like the sun, and his feet were like pillars of fire. He had a little book opened in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, and cried in a loud voice as when a lion roars. When he cried out, 7 thunders uttered their voices. Now when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered, and do not write them. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and the land raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heavens and the things that are in it, and earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, and that they should be delayed no longer. But in the days of the sounding of the 7th angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God will be finished, as he declared to his servants the prophets. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and the earth. So I went to the angel and said to him, give me the little book. And he said to me, take it and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. Then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter, and he said to me, "You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings." And what this is referring to, theoretically speaking, is this is when you start to see Israel or African Americans or whatever you want to call it, Black people. God puts in them his word, which is sweet to the mouth, meaning you'll see this a lot even in the Old Testament. For the Old Testament prophets, God gives them a message. The message God gives is as sweet as honey. However, when it comes to actually reciting the message that God gives you, because you're going up against the powers that be, it's enough to put like a knot in your stomach. So God starts giving his people a voice, and you start seeing people begin to give speeches and to speak out against a lot of the things that they're seeing. And so the message is sweet. However, the actual act of reciting this message would turn your stomach bitter. This happens to anyone who has to actually go out there and tell the truth against all odds. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod. And the angel stood saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it. For it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And this we know to be 3.5 years. I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." Now, who are the 2 witnesses? The 2 witnesses that God is referring to, or that John is referring to, depending on which way you look at it, are going to be the 2 churches in the very beginning that are without rebuke. And if you go back to the very beginning, the only 2 churches that are without rebuke are going to be Smyrna and Philadelphia. And if you remember the map that I gave or showed last time, this is going to be North America, the church in North America, and the church in Africa, the Philadelphia Brotherly Love, as I said before, is going to be the Muslims. Now, where do we see Muslim or Africa and North America come together in a time period? This is going to be the civil rights movement. This is when you see historically the Nation of Islam, Muslim faith comes to America. And this is where you see Black Muslims I don't want to say for the first time, but this is when they come on the scene. And then this is also where you see civil rights also starting to take place. And I will dive into that as soon as I'm finished with this whole passage. I'll explain the whole thing. It says these are the 2 olive trees, meaning that they're anointed and blessed, and the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. Remember, the lampstands are the churches. And remember, these are groups of people at locations. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemy. The fire isn't real fire. They're not dragons. Fire equals the Spirit of God. Remember, because of the tongues of fire. And the gold lampstands also have fire, and that's how God moves among his people. So these people are going to literally going to be speaking with the Spirit of God. That's why fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. They don't really cause people to die. Right? But these have the power to shut up heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And we know that the prophet who displays this very well is Elijah. And they have the power over waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. And we know the prophet who was famous for that is going to be Moses. So far, we have 2 locations, 2 groups of people, and we have Moses and we have Elijah. So I'm going to stop right there for 1 second, and I'm going to explain. So I suppose right about now, historically speaking, this is the civil rights. This would be relatively like 1960, maybe even earlier than that, 1950, whenever it started. And so as we've been told by pastors and other religious figures in the past that in the last days, we will see Elijah, we will see Moses. And I bet the biggest question right about now is, when did we see Elijah, right? And when did we see Moses? What I'm about to share is going to really blow your mind if you haven't already caught on just yet. So the first prophet I'm going to go over, who did they name first? They named Elijah. I'm going to go over Elijah. The prophet who was Elijah that we did not know at the time was Elijah is going to be Malcolm X. And remember, it says that they had the power to shut up the heavens so it didn't rain for 3 years, whatever. Elijah prophesied it didn't rain, but when he did pray, and it finally did get ready to rain, he asked his servant, well, go look now and see. And he said that he saw a cloud the size of a man's hand. And in some translations, it says fist. And we all know that that is the symbol. The man's fist is a symbol for the Black Power movement. Malcolm X himself was not the leader of the Black Panther Party. However, the things that he stood for were that. Malcolm X was a prophet. A lot of the things that Malcolm X preached and prophesied about were the things that were to come for Israel. And one of the things that he was working to try to build is Black empowerment, for us to find a way to become our own nations, whether that be the United States pay reparations to Black people for the free labor of their ancestors, and to use that money to help us build up our nation within a nation. He also felt like that the United States should give land and territory to African Americans to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, be self-sufficient until, as a nation, they were able to make it back to Africa. Also, he felt like we should reunite with other African Americans, brown, light brown, Israel, whoever, just Black people in general should really group together around the world to help strengthen and build each other up on the 7 different continents. Remember, because this is a world thing, to be able to be self-sufficient among ourselves. And so, yeah, if you remember Malcolm X, he was not popular at all. If anyone was Elijah, it was that man right there. There was not one interview he went in that he didn't have accuracy, honesty. He wasn't unclear. He didn't stumble under his words or under pressure. He literally told the truth. Everything that came out of his mouth was literally the Spirit of God speaking through that man about the things that were to come for Israel and the things that were to come for Babylon. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1965. That's February 21, 1965. And remember, the Bible talks about how the witnesses prophesy for 3.5 years, give or take, and then they are killed. And so upon leaving the Nation of Islam, he's killed. And that brings us to the next prophet or the next witness, remember? So he's Africa. That's the Church of Brotherly Love. That's Philadelphia. And then you have Moses. And who was Moses? When did we see Moses, you ask? Well, that's going to be Martin Luther King. Moses, if you remember correctly in the Bible, was a lawgiver. He went and he was the one who got the laws for Israel from God. Martin Luther King was the one who worked to change the laws for God's people, or for African Americans, depending on how you look at it, Israel, through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act. He literally changed the law. Remember that the biblical Moses marched the people up out of Egypt, and you see Martin Luther King leading peaceful marches and protests. This wasn't for nothing. Martin Luther King understood the universal law that Moses also understood during his time, which is whatever you put out, it comes back. I've talked about this in one of my other videos. And so the idea of a peaceful, nonviolent protests on a huge mass scale, if you have a bunch of people working to be nonviolent, to change things for the better, then the idea is that if on a mass scale nonviolence is put out, then on a mass scale nonviolence should technically universally be given back. And so that was his aim and his strategy for that. Also, if you remember, the biblical Moses led Israel to the promised land and was given a view of the promised land from the mountaintop, but he didn't actually go in to the promised land. He died before that happened. And then you see Martin Luther King give his last speech, which revealed his true identity. The last speech he ever gave the night before he died, which was, "I've been to the mountaintop," identifies him as the biblical Moses that Revelations is talking about. And remember, it goes back to the witnesses who prophesied for 3 years. So Malcolm X prophesies and he dies 1965. And exactly, give or take, 3 years later, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King dies. So there you have your 3 years given to each of the prophets, and they are both killed. And it says, when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends up out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom in Egypt, where our Lord was crucified. Then those people from the tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days and not allow their dead bodies to be put in graves. And those who dwell on the earth will overjoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. Now, after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them in the same hour. Let me stop right there. So what they're talking about during this period is spiritualness. Both of them, I'm not explaining this in a different video, but both of them were of Masonic brotherhood in some way, shape, or form. These are builders. You have the Masonic knowledge is in its own right very biblical. It goes hand in hand. You are supposed to have Masonic knowledge. However, in this day and age, to have any sort of Masonry knowledge or affiliation to the Brotherhood is a little bit tricky, because you are allowed to build whatever you want as long as it is in the confines of what they want you to build. So if you start working against the system that they have created or try to take down the structure that they have created, they'll kill you, or if you spill the secrets or whatever, which is why Masonic knowledge was what Israel once had. However, who's overseeing it now is what makes it not so good. And so they also, there's some ritual that gets done, or there's some rite that gets done for Masonic brotherhoods when someone passes. However, if they don't claim you as a brother or whatever the case may be, then they just skip that part. So a lot of the stuff that I just went over is stuff that was happening spiritually, not actually. These men did not get back up physically. This is being happening in the spirit. And in the same hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. In the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to God of heaven. The second woe was past. Behold, the third woe was coming quickly. And coincidentally, just like biblically speaking, there was a great earthquake and 1/10 of the city fell. After Malcolm X passed, there were riots. After Martin Luther King passed, there were riots. So the earthquake and the 1/10 of the city falling talks about the mass destruction that happened and the chaos that followed after the death of these 2 men. And so you have the MLK riots, you have the Harlem riots. If anyone wants to know what God is doing or where his spirit was moving, you just should listen to the speeches and the knowledge of those two men. And it wasn't just them two specifically there, but biblically speaking, scripture-wise, God is referring to those two. Out of those two came so many more others working along the same lines for the same things that those two men were trying to create and do. And so if you want to know how God was moving, go back and learn the history and the things that were happening during that time period. And so now we're coming up on, let's see if I have enough time, chapter 12. So because I have enough time, I'll go ahead and explain this one. Now a great sign appeared in the heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So we know when we see sun and moon and stars, we know that that's Catholicism. The moon is Muslim or Islam. And then the stars are, especially since this says 12 stars, this is going to be one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And you've heard a lot of like spiritual institutions say that the woman clearly in Revelations 12 has to be Mary, right? Because she's so divine. But she's actually not Mary, because Mary lived and now she's gone. And this is, remember that these are prophecies along a timeline. So we're still in that 2,000 year timeline period. And so this is a woman who has great hierarchy. And I'm going to read a little bit and then I'm going to break down the prophecy for what it is. It says, "Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head." And remember, that's just Babylon. It's not an actual dragon. We're just talking about a spiritual institution that is Babylon, that sits on all the waters, which is why it has 7 heads and it has 10 horns, because it has the 10, kingdoms, etc. Anyway, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all the nations with an iron rod. And remember, in the first video of Revelations part 1, I told you to remember when Christ is speaking to the church in what? In Europe, and says that if they succeed, they will be given a what? An iron rod to rule the nations. And so we know this prophecy is dealing with Europe in some way. The prophecy, I'm going to go ahead and just spoil it for you, and then I'm going to read the rest. This prophecy in particular is talking about the royal family. I know it's shocking, right? Like, oh, this is, you wouldn't think that it's in the Bible, but it's in there. So a lot of stuff that is pertaining to Israel and different things about the fall of Babylon is going to be in there. Not every single event, most events. This is about the, what's her name? The Meghan and the, what's her husband's name? The Meghan and Harry situation. So we all know there was a bunch of stuff going on when she was getting ready to marry him. And this is a prophecy about their first child, because this is supposedly the first drop of African American blood, as small as it may be, people, but it still is, in royal blood, in royal lineage for the first time in a very long time. And so this is about her firstborn son. And it says, And the child was caught up to God and his throne, which we all know this one part is a mixed up translation. So the throne, that it should have said Satan. But for some reason in this translation, it says God and his throne, which is in the earlier letters. Remember, Christ says, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. After she gives birth, her and Harry take their child and they go and they live in Canada for a while. Don't ask me why, because I don't know why, but that is what that's talking about. And it says, and then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared for her by God, that she should be fed, that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. So that's like a couple of years. And then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon with his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives to death. Therefore rejoice, all heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having a great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But she was given 2 wings of a great eagle, which is the United States. So if you follow their story, for some reason, which they don't say really why, they were in Canada for a while. After that stops working, they fly into the United States and take refuge, I think, in California. And by the time I think they go to Canada in like 2017. Just like how the prophecy says, she's taken care of there for for 1,262 days. And we know that's about a couple of years. When they make it to the United States, they just make it in time for 2020, which is roughly the time given in the prophecy, 3 years or some change. She's given the wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is to be nourished for a time and half a time. So that would be about 2023. See how the Bible has caught us up already? From the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman. He went to make war with the rest of her offspring, not her particular, but just the rest of Israel, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, if you're wondering about the flood that the dragon spewed after the woman, you'll just have to watch that documentary that they made talking about everything that they went through concerning the royal family. But that prophecy that brings us to chapter 13, we are all caught up. In another video, I can dive into chapter 13. We are actually living in that time right now. Prophecies don't usually open up until we're either right on it or it's already past. And so really, when it comes to prophecies, anytime after this, you can only sort of kind of guesstimate. Meaning, so actually, before I continue with that, back to the 2020 incident. So when it says, then the dragon was enraged with the woman and went out to make war with the rest of her offspring. This is why also you see in 2020 and the few years leading up to that, and then the few years after that, you get all of these Black Lives Matter incidences with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. This is where you see, like, if anyone was wondering, why is there so much racial tension, like, right about now? And, like, cops are doing crazy things to black people and all the rest of that stuff. This is it, people. This is why. We had no clue why. We're like, what's going on? Why is this even happening? Because everything that is going on is biblical. And I know that a lot of Christians don't want to get involved when it comes to racial things, but literally it's all biblical. And so if you sit up there and you ignore God's people when they're getting persecuted, killed, and all the rest of that stuff, you are ignoring God himself. And it took me a long time to figure out that the Bible and things that are happening racially are biblically connected. They're not separate like how I once thought. And this is also what Christ talks about, where he says that his saints and his people are going to need to have patience, because if anything that I have shown you from the different prophecies is that we don't make progress and we are not able to move unless God moves us. So it's not even us doing it. It's literally God. And so that's the only way we succeed, move, and have our being, make progress. It's not us ourselves. It's literally God that does it for us. And so let me check my time. That's 32 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up here, because in my next video, I'm going to talk about chapter 13 and a little bit after that, as it pertains to what are the next move for God's people. If African Americans are God's people, if he sent Moses and Elijah already, and it was Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and many others who followed in their footsteps with the same message, because that's the message that God gave his people. And if the seals that were broken were really European colonization, and that's Babylon, and God's going to overthrow Babylon, then what is the move? What is the next move for God's people that we should be looking out for? This is what Christ means by when he says to keep watch, keep a lookout, so that way you know what you're supposed to be looking for. You are not supposed to be getting worked up and stressed out over wars overseas that these white people are doing. You're not supposed to get worked up, stressed out over presidential elections. As you can see, none of the presidential elections were covered in the book of Revelations. Certain things that God is doing among his people are recorded, and only those such things. In my next video, I will break down the next step for God's people. And let me tell you right now, it will knock your socks off. It's highly controversial. It's almost a suicide mission. God is going to have to truly be with his people when they make this move. Otherwise, it'll fall straight through. But I encourage you to go back and study out the things that I have just said for yourselves, because it's highly controversial. Thank you so much. Like and subscribe.